Growing up is a scam. As an adult, it would appear that all the magic seems to have been drained out of daily life, and we are stuck with the grey of overcast skies and sensible clothing. Between the worries of making life happen and all the associated money-making, life admin, relationship management, and associated problems, there is nothing to make one believe that wishes could come true. But what if you could have, for the price of a gift shop souvenir, a wish, your heart's desire? What would you ask for? And if you got it, would it truly make you happy? Hi, I'm Rumbi. Welcome to There's a Book for That, a podcast in which I, a bookworm, talk about different books I have read and apply lessons or themes from those books to social issues. Today's subject is the Djinn in the Nightingale's Eye, or as it was in the movie adaptation featuring Tilda Swinton and Idris Elba, 3,000 Years of Longing. I watched the movie before I read the book, and I loved the movie so much that I read the book to kind of compare. And honestly, it's quite an event. When the Djinn offers our heroine 3 wishes, she starts small, and in the movie, it's a throwaway wish. In the book, it's something weightier. But then she makes another wish. I wish, said Dr. Gillian Perholt to the Djinn, quote, I wish you would love me, end quote. The main reason why I wanted to read the book is that I so loved what Gillian wished for, but as I watched the movie, I couldn't help but feel that something was off. As I watched Tilda Swinton, who we know to be a slim, very slim, tall lady, I couldn't help but think, that's not right. That woman in that body doesn't need to wish for love. To wish for love instead of world peace, instead of money, instead of good health, or a trip to Barbados, or I don't know, a cornucopia of things. She asks for love, and it just seemed so fat. Her wish was so personal, so lacking in utility. It's so not dinner with Jay-Z or financial security. She asks the Djinn to love her. And I just thought, this is a fat woman's wish. If, as I suspected, this was a fat woman's wish, where was the fat woman? And so I went to the book, and yes, just as I suspected, the woman in the book is fuller figured. Described as, quote, an ample woman, a stout woman with a soft, clear skin, clothed in the kind of draped linen dress and jacket that is best for stout women. Dr. Gillian Perholt, our heroine, is a fatty, a fluffy girl, a traditionally built lady. Let's rewind and talk about how we got to wishes. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Written in 1994 by A.S. Byatt, according to a Wikipedia page, as part of a collection of short stories, the subject of our discussion is the title piece, The Djinn in the Nightingale's Eye, and it is a beautiful little story, well worth a visit. The name comes from a scene in the story in which the heroine, Gillian, meets a djinn in a glass bottle which has the name The Nightingale's Eye, Çeşme il Bulbul in Turkish. Forgive my pronunciation, I'm trying, guys. Described as, quote, largely irrelevant and therefore happy, end quote, Gillian Perholt was, quote, a narratologist, a being of secondary order whose days were spent hunched in great libraries, interpreting, decoding the fairy tales of childhood and the vodka posters of the grown-up world, the unending romances of golden coffee drinkers, etc., end quote. From what I can understand, she analyzed stories for their deeper meanings. Listeners, it may well be that by joining me on this journey, you too now put on the cloak of a narratologist. Let's see how it goes. So, finding herself finally free after her husband ran away with a 26-year-old Emmeline Porter, This vibrant woman in her 50s, whose 2 children are adults living far away, spends her days hidden in the joys of academia. Gillian has an opportunity to share her wisdom at a conference of narratologists in Turkey. Quote, although she was now redundant as a woman, being neither wife, mother, nor mistress, I assume here that the author is being satirical and not giving us the 3 uses of a woman. The quote continues, she was by no means redundant as a narratologist, but on the contrary, in demand everywhere. End quote. One of the joys of scholarship that Gillian finds is the opportunity to travel. And on this trip to Turkey, adventure finds our heroine. She's thriving, living her best life with old friends and new. During her presentation, she has an odd vision, for want of a better word, of a cavernous female form, a large, strange, quote, flat-breasted creature, end quote, which stops her in her tracks and causes her to think that this is what she fears, becoming a flat-breasted creature. Patriarchy is strong with this one. We'll learn later that as a child, she was prone to such visions, laying the foundation for our story, blowing the grains of magic dust into our eyes, weaving us into the enchantment. The encounter, vision, intrusion, whatever, leaves her unsettled, as is to be expected. But she manages to shake it off, finish her presentation, and enjoy her time with her friends. Go Gillian. The next day, on a tour of a museum, she meets an ancient mariner who takes her on a tour of the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations. Here again, we encounter a recurring motive of our story. Motif. English is not my first language. The ancient mariner, harnessing his knowledge of the museum in his role as a guide, points out an image of a goddess. Quote, she was, look at her, the fat little woman. They loved fat. It meant strength and good prospects of children and living through the winter. To those naked people, they were probably thin and half-starved with hunting and hiding in holes. So they made her fat. Fat was life to them. They worshipped the fat woman. We think they thought everything came out of her hole. End quote. A day or 2 later, nearing the end of her trip, she visits a souvenir shop with her friend where she finds, quote, a very dusty bottle among the apparently unsorted pile of new/old things, end quote. As a collector of glass paperweights, she was drawn to this interesting bottle, which her friend tells her could be Chesimil Bulbul, the Nightingale's eye. She must have it, and have it she does. And later that evening, after a shower, she remembers that she has a dusty glass bottle in her bag and decides to run it under running water, giving it a rub. Yes, friends, this is that sort of story. It is a magic bottle, and out of it flies a djinn, larger than life, larger than the room even. But as he shrinks himself to fit the room, we discover that he is a hardy, anatomically correct, and generously proportioned. I'm not sure why this is necessary, but it is alluded to more than once, so I have to mention it. In the movie, the hottie is Idris Elba, so peak hotness. If a little hairy, green, and golden, which is apparently how Djinn are, if anybody's looking. He quickly learns English from the TV, a handy trope, thus saving us from her broken French, and they begin to talk. He wants to know about her. He's been in the bottle a while, and he knows that the world has changed. For the kindness of setting him free from the bottle, she has earned 3 wishes, and with the final wish, he will be completely free. Thus, we find ourselves in Gillian's hotel room with a beautiful giant djinn in front of her, offering her the world. Gillian makes 2 wishes, and it is this woman, whose husband fulfilled a cliché and proved himself a coward, whose children flew the nest and never looked back, whose ample body is showing the ravages of age, the lines of experience. It is this woman, not some thin woman who's been fighting aging with potions, lotions, Botox, and starvation, who makes the wish that we will now examine. A fat woman is the one who wishes for love. Sort of, you'll find out. In my view, to wish for love when one is offered essentially the world is the behavior of someone who says yes to seconds, yes to dessert, chocolate in bed, pancakes for breakfast. It is the wish of someone who believes in making cake, not war, even though there are times when she should perhaps choose war. It is the wish of someone with secret hopes and desires, the fulfillment of which those around her might not think she deserves. It is the wish of someone who doesn't care if they deserve it. They want it, and considering that we're talking about magic, is brave enough to ask. It is a decadent wish. It's a wish without the misery of self-denial and continuous discipline. Please note that I'm not saying that fat people are undisciplined, because I, as a fat woman, completed a 31-kilometer swim in 3 weeks earlier this year, which took a lot of discipline and stamina. But there is this one area where food is involved, where one chooses to say yes to oneself often. You'll also notice that I don't mention greed if I don't necessarily equate or associate them. In this book, this woman says yes to herself, and in that act of saying yes to one's desires, instead of doing yet another bone broth diet or eating air or whatever today's fashionable diet involves, she chooses love. In a world in which being fat is so undesirable that people seem rabid when they see a fat woman being loved out loud, our Gigi, that's what we're going to call her, asks for love. Caveat here that I'm only talking about heterosexual relationships. I'm here for the heterosexual fat black girls. Poor things. In this context, we know that there's a lot of movement about fat women being desirable for sex. They're sexualized and fetishized, but also reduced to warm bodies instead of full beings. Even when they find love, there are plenty of people who think that they should not. So, to be a fat woman and to ask for this one thing that everyone else is asking for, to push to the front of the line and say me first when everyone around is grumbling, seemed to be brave. Until I read the book. In the movie, Gillian starts out skeptical, wishes are not to be believed, there are no such things, it's silly, unintended consequences. She wishes a silly wish and the Djinn grants it. It is understood that it is silly. Then she asks him to love her. It's pretty cute, it's simple. In the book, things are markedly different. They are heavier, darker, and wishes are not simple, even though they are granted. In the book she asks, quote, I wish, say Gillian, for my body to be as it was when I last really liked it, if you can do that. The great green eyes settled on her stout figure in its white robe and turban. I can do that, he said. I can do that. If you're quite sure that that is what you most desire, I can make your cells as they were, but I cannot delay your fate. It is courteous of you to tell me that, Gillian. And yes, it is what I desire. It is what I have desired hopelessly every day for the last 10 years, whatever else I may have desired. And yet, said the Djinn, Idris Elba, you're well enough as you are, in my opinion. Then he says the Idris Elba Djinn was generously proportioned, anatomically correct. Amplitude, madame, is desirable. Take a little break, drink some water. The scene continues. Not in my culture, said Gillian. And moreover, there is the question of temporal decay. That, I suppose, the Djinn, but do not understand sympathetically. We are made of fire and do not decay. You are made of dust and return to it. The next bit is important. He grants the wish with a lazy swish of his finger, and immediately, quote, she feels a fierce contraction in the walls of her belly, in her loose womb. Then he says, I am glad to see you prefer ripe women to green girls, say the Djinn. I too am of that opinion. But your ideal is a little meager. Would you not care to be rounder? Gillian didn't respond, instead excusing herself and retreating into the bathroom where she examines her new old body. Quote, She saw in the demisted mirror a solid and unexceptional 35-year-old whose breasts were full but not softened, whose stomach was taut, whose thighs were smooth, whose nipples were round and rosy. I can go in the streets, she said to herself, and still be recognizably who I am. In my free and happy life. Only I shall feel better. I shall like myself more. That was an intelligent wish. I shall not regret it. End quote. So the first reading of this I found really troubling. It led me to that fat to hot montage, the one with all the big changes. As a fat in the movies, she's barely average size, but everyone is talking about how hideously obese she is. That fat woman who's apparently only ugly because she's fat decides that she will show her detractors or that guy who scorned her by getting beautiful real thin. In one of my favorite movies, The Mirror Has Two Faces with Barbra Streisand, we're told that Barbra Streisand is somehow fat and unattractive. Barbra Streisand. She's like a UK size 6. I won't even bring up my good friend Bridget. We're constantly told that we have to change in order to be acceptable, attractive, valuable. We're told that there is an acceptable body for love, and in order to be loved, you have to be in that acceptable body. If you are not in that acceptable body, you are a figure for ridicule and hate. You are also invisible, unless you are chosen to be the object of ridicule and hate for the day. I sometimes joke about how I could probably rob a bank or, commit a crime, because as a fat woman dressed up as some kind of cleaner, I don't think I'd be noticed. It's very easy to be invisible when people don't want to look at you because you're not attractive. Your aesthetics are not pleasing. To be thin is to be automatically attractive in this world, which is why I did not buy Tilda Swinton as someone who would wish for love when love, I'm guessing, is chasing her around. I'm guessing that's why they left that out of the movie. With the second reading of the book, I overcame my disappointment to focus on the story within the wish, which led me down a different path, because while Gillian asked for a smaller body, it was not just a smaller body, but the last body she liked. The skinification montages always have as a singular aim getting women to the smallest size possible, whether or not they look good. Just being the same size as a girl in the magazine is seen as being enough. You made it, girl, whether or not you look like you have a mega mind head, or you won't be able to sustain such extreme weight loss. Gillian asked for a body she was happy with, not just a smaller body, because she wanted a safe but more comfortable body. This realization and how close it hit home led me to another book. Buy one, get one free, lucky you. Roxane Gay's memoir, Hunger. I'm going to be honest here and give those of you who need it the chance to get out while you still can. So I started out wanting to make a really surface point that all bodies deserve love, whether or not they conform to societal expectations. I remember speaking to friends and noting with shock that they would not date someone who was disabled, just because, and thinking that was more than a little gross, but maybe more common than I realized. People whose lives are lived out in bodies that do not conform to the standards set by Western beauty standards, darker skin, bigger, disabled, larger noses, smaller eyes, the butt that looks big and everything, have long been objects of mockery and horror. I wanted to invoke the magic of the Djinn and invite love into the lives of those who don't meet the standard. But that second reading messed me up. I took a deeper dive than I wanted, and so now I would like to remind you that this episode will deal with some difficult subjects, and the last point to turn back is here. If hearing about sexual assault might ruin your day, please take the first message, watch the movie, and absolutely do not read the book. If you're still here, put your seatbelts on, let's dive in. So, Gillian, before asking the Djinn to love her, asks that he would restore to her the body that she was last happy with, and he does. Then, with that level of trust established, the Djinn says, tell me something about yourself, something that you have never told anyone, something you have never trusted to any lover in the depth of night, to any friends in the warmth of an evening, something you have kept for me. I expressed disappointment about the first wish, but continued reading leads us to an interesting story. This is a book about stories, and we all have stories to share. And it can often be difficult to talk about some of the things that hurt us, But when we find a kindred or listening soul, it becomes easier. And so it is that with our Gillian, the love of stories, tells a story that will ring true for many. I will read all the main parts of the story to maintain an unbroken line of thought. It's a bit long, but please bear with. Tell me, said the Djinn. It is insignificant. Tell me. Once, I was a bridesmaid to a good friend from my college who wanted a white wedding with veils and flowers and organ music. Though she was happily settled with a man already, they slept together. She said that she was blissfully happy, and I believe he was. At college, she seemed very poised and formidable. A woman of power, a woman of sexual experience, which was unusual in my day. She was full of bodily grace and capable of being happy, which most of us were not. It was fashionable to be disturbed and anguished for women in those days, and probably for young men too. We were a generation when there was something shameful about being an unmarried woman, a spinster. Though we were all clever, my friends and I, we all had this greed for knowledge. And my friend, whom I shall call Susanna, it wasn't her name, but I can't go on without one, my friend had always seemed to me to come from somewhere rather grand, a beautiful house with beautiful things. But when I arrived at her wedding, her house was much like mine, in a row of similar houses. The marriage went off beautifully. She had a lovely dress, like a princess out of a story. Those were the days of the princess line in dresses. On the day, she looked so lovely, out of another world. I had a big hat with a brim. It suited me. You can imagine the dresses I expect, but you cannot imagine the house, the place. If you say I cannot, replied the Djinn obligingly. Why do you tell me this tale? I cannot believe this is what you have not told. The night of the wedding, said Gillian Perholt, we bathed together in her parents' little bathroom. It had tiles with fishes with trailing fins and big soulful cartoon eyes. Cartoon? Disney. It doesn't matter. Comic tiles. Comic? It doesn't matter. We didn't share the bath, but we washed together. And, say the Djinn, she made love to you. No, said Dr. Perholt, she didn't. I saw myself, first in the mirror, and then I looked down at myself, and then I looked across at her. She was pearly white, and I was more golden, and she was soft and sweet. And you were not? I was perfect. Just at that moment, just at the end of being a girl and before I was a woman really, I was perfect. Gillian remembered her own small, beautifully rising breasts, her warm, flat belly, her long, slender ankles, her waist. Her waist. She said, Susanna, some man is going to go mad with desire for you. And Gillian Perholt said, and I was all proud inside my skin, as never before or since, all golden. 2 girls in a suburban bathroom. The Djinn said, but when I changed you, that's not what you became. You're very nice now, very acceptable, very desirable, but not perfect. It was terrifying. I was terrified. It was like she found a completely unexpected phrase. Like having a weapon, a sharp sword I couldn't handle. Ah, yes, said the Djinn. Terrible as an army with banners. But it didn't belong to me. I was tempted to love it myself. It was lovely, but unreal. I mean, it was there, it was real enough, but I knew in my heart it wouldn't stay. Something would happen to it. I owed it. She went on searching for feelings she had never interrogated. I owed it some sort of adequate act, and I wasn't going to live up to it. She caught her breath on a sigh. I'm a creature of the mind, not the body, Djinn. I can look after my mind. I took care of that, despite everything. Is that the end of the story? Said the Djinn, after another silence. Your stories are strange. They petter out. They have no shape. It is what my culture likes, or liked. But no, it is not the end. There is a little bit more. In the morning, Susanna's father brought my breakfast in bed. A boiled egg in a woolly cosy, a little silver-plated pot of tea in a cozy, knitted to look like a cottage, toast in a tea rack, butter in a butter dish, all on a little tray with folding legs, like the trays old ladies have in homes. He suddenly leaned forward and pulled my nightdress off my shoulders. He put his hands round my perfect breasts, said Dr. Berholt, who was 55 and now looked 32, and he put his sad face between them. He had glasses that were all steamed up and knocked sideways. He had a bristly little mustache that crept over my flesh like a centipede. He snuffled among my breasts, and all he said was, "I can't bear it." And he rubbed his body against my counterpane. He snuffled and jerked and twisted my breasts in his hands. And then he unfolded the little legs of the tray, put it over my legs, and went away to give his daughter away, which he did with great dignity and charm. I felt sick, and I felt my body was to blame, as though out of what she said lucidly was spun snuffling and sweat and three-piece suites and artificial silk and tea cozies. And that is the end of the story, said the Djinn. He's actually been interrupting this whole time, but I saved you, His Reverence. You're welcome. That is where a story would end it in my country. Odd. And you met me and asked for the body of a 32-year-old woman. I didn't. I asked for it to be as it was when I last liked it. I didn't like it then. I half worshipped it, but it scared me. This is my body. I find it pleasant. I don't mind looking at it. Like the potter who puts a deliberate flaw in the perfect pot. Maybe, if having lived a little is a flaw, which it is, that girl's ignorance was a burden to her. End quote. Sorry for the long reading, but I wanted Gillian to tell her own story in her own words. She took a rather circuitous route, but when people tell difficult stories, it is often difficult for them to tell them head on. One deserves the chance to take the scenic route, if the destination is Mordor. So, as we have seen, for some of us, our smallest bodies are not necessarily our happiest bodies. Those small bodies come with problems that we find it difficult to overcome. Problems that we do not invite, but which follow these little bodies, drawn to us like a shark to chum. For Gillian, her small, perfect body was dangerous. And this really is the crux of our story today. Roxane Gay, in her memoir, Hunger, speaks about her own sexual assault at the hand of a trusted friend and his friends when she was 12. She did not say anything at the time because at 12, one often finds one doesn't have the words to explain such a horrifying experience. But as a direct result of that, she began to hate her body and made a conscious decision to change it, to make it less attractive so that she could be safe. And as a result, put on a lot of weight. Quote, I don't know how things got so out of control. Or I do. This is my refrain. Losing control of my body was a matter of accretion. I began eating to change my body. I was willful in this. Some boys had destroyed me and I had barely survived. I knew I wouldn't be able to endure another such violation. And so I ate because I thought that if my body became repulsive, I could keep men away. Even at that young age, I understood that to be fat was to be undesirable to men, to be beneath their contempt. This is what most girls are taught, that we should be slender and small. We should not take up space. We should be seen and not heard. And if we're seen, we should be pleasing to men, acceptable to society. And most women know this, that we're supposed to disappear by something that needs to be said loudly over and over again so that we can resist surrendering to what is expected of us. End quote. As I read her book, I wondered if this was normal. Part of me believes that this is a very sensible strategy, though we know that those who attack people, who rape and assault, are not acting out of attraction, but to exercise power. And so even this is no protection. At my smallest, as an adult, I had lost weight through anxiety. I had a lot going on at that time, so I lost 20 kilos in 3 months, just because I wasn't eating. I had butterflies in my stomach all the time. I didn't feel hungry. My then boyfriend won his way into my heart partly by asking me if I had eaten every day. And when at 6 p.m. I replied no, he would take me to Nando's, where I tried my best to eat a piece of chicken and some grilled pineapple. There was one day I remember struggling with an almond croissant the whole day I was trying to finish that one thing. I was smaller than I'd ever been. But I didn't feel cuter because I had so much going on that I didn't even think about my body at that time. I didn't think about whether it was an achievement. I wore smaller clothes. I got them from my friends. Everyone paid me compliments, but I don't remember it being a thing like, oh, wow, look at me. Because I was just so distracted by everything else. And yet, it was in this smaller body that I experienced sexual harassment at work. The only time that I was sexually harassed at work, I've never been sexually harassed at work before or since. So there's a part of me that associates that experience with a smaller body. Growing up, I used to boast about not being kidnappable. I'm not portable. And it's not worth it because if you see someone carrying a fat woman down the street, you're going to pay attention. You're going to look. You're going to pay attention. Yeah? Why? Because the bodyguard wasn't made with a fat woman. Fat women don't get these romantic stories. So you'd be suspicious about some sweaty, grunty man carrying my unconscious body about. Unless the assailant was dressed like a fireman and lifted me out of the building like the mum in What's Eating Gilbert Grape, it would just attract too much attention. So I was very confident walking about at night, coming from the library. My body in itself was a deterrent. When that man at work felt confident, leaning into me in full view of the office, whispering about giving me 6 children, my smaller body must have contributed to that. My smaller body made me fit the standard of beauty more closely, and it made me vulnerable. I felt safer in the bigger body, but when you feel small, you're vulnerable. And when I was small then, at 80 kilos, I was vulnerable enough for this man in my workplace to make all these inappropriate comments and make me feel even smaller. Perhaps one day we'll talk about why financial independence is important, because if I had the money, I would have left that day and never come back. My small body was not safe. But this was not the first time. In an even smaller body than Roxanne Gay when she was raped, and my small body when I was harassed at work, my tiny little body was violated. While walking through the paradise that was the trade fair in Zimbabwe in the late 90s, surrounded by rides such as the octopus and the big wheel and candy floss machines and toffee apples, a man, a grown man, grabbed me by my pussy. I remember being shocked when Donald Trump said this and the recording was making the rounds because I literally knew what that meant. A grown man in public walked past and grabbed my wee-wee and kept walking. I turned around. Why did this man touch my wee-wee? I was so confused. He was looking back. He wanted me to know that he had done it, done something to me that I would not have the vocabulary to describe until years later, decades even. Perhaps that vulnerability was the attraction, the smallness. Small bodies are not safe. I was 8, maybe 9, and this man with his practiced predatory hand ripped away my innocence through my little wee-wee, whose only function then was to wee-wee because I was just a baby, and kept walking. He didn't stop. He's probably out there somewhere, a husband, a father, a respected member of the community, much like Susanna's dad in Gillian's story, living his best life, my sullied wee-wee, a dusty trophy in his brain's cabinet of perversions. Small bodies are not safe. In the US, the CDC reported that while most children do not report sexual abuse at the time, however, research shows that about a quarter of girls and a sixth of boys are sexually abused before the age of 18. If my maths is right, that's about 3 to 5 children per classroom of 20 to 25 students. Small bodies are vulnerable, and so it would make sense that people look for ways to become less vulnerable. In an article titled The Second Assault, published in The Atlantic in 2015, Olga Kazan interviewed different people who had experience of both being sexually assaulted and being overweight. According to the article, quote, research shows that in general, childhood sexual abuse might be an important predictor of obesity and overweight in adulthood, end quote. She tells the heartbreaking story of Christine White, who experienced sexual assault as a child, quote, when White was an infant, her mother began, quote, when White was an infant, Her mother began dating a man 26 years her senior, and he lived with the family until White was 10. Though to outsiders he seemed affable, the father was largely unemployed, according to White, and he had a boorish streak. He was the kind of guy who would beep at pretty girls walking down the street, she said, even with his kids in the car. At home, his immaturity had a sinister element, White said. A number of times after White showered, he'd make a parade in front of him naked so he could inspect her. During games of Yahtzee, he would force her to sit on his lap for longer than was comfortable. He'd grab her behind and make flirtatious comments. Occasionally, he'd put a treat in his pocket and cajole her into fishing around for it. I knew that I didn't like what was happening, she said, but I didn't know what was appropriate. To her teen self, White's body was criminal. I felt like I was always in a battle with food. I just thought, this body needs to be tamed. It makes terrible things happen. End quote. The author is careful to point out that this did not lead to Christine becoming obese, but Christine's fear of her own body as a magnet for danger is understandable. Much like Gillian and Roxane Gay, the smaller body attracted danger, and the larger body was a refuge, a way of becoming invisible, so that wicked eyes with cruel hands stayed away. I don't want to leave the impression that I'm making a causal link here between sexual abuse as a child and obesity. Oh, absolutely not. While there are quite a few studies showing a correlation, the research is not yet enough to give us a real picture. Most of the research started in the past 20 years, I suppose, as people started to think more about the causes of obesity rather than just assuming that fat people were just greedy piggies. But when we read the article and we hear from people like Christine White or other people interviewed, when we hear from practitioners, I've put some of the links that I looked at, working with people who are working towards healthier eating patterns, or read stories such as Roxane Gay's, it should be enough to make us think a little deeper about the surface issues. Some of the research that I looked at found that people who have experienced sexual assault, if they lose the weight and they get into that smaller body and start to feel unsafe, might put the weight back on to feel safe again. While this area of research is in its infancy with a few causal links established, doctors working with overweight patients in a bid to help them get smaller found in multiple cases that there was a high incidence of sexual assault among their patients who struggled with their weight. Additionally, I must point out that I'm not saying that all fat bodies are the product of trauma. Of course not. We also just like to eat. But it's significant enough for us to talk about it differently. I'm also someone who finds larger bodies attractive. So in analyzing these books and pulling up these stats, I want to make it clear that any potentially causal link aside, were it not for social stigma, I believe that more people would be happy on the fat side. Traditionally built subjects of Rubens' artwork like fat goddesses spilling out curves and fertility, happy eaters proudly eating and walking and thus being healthy instead of hiding in their closets, feeling too ashamed to be outside, go to the gym or for a swim because people are going to take videos of them and laugh. When I started out with the planning of this episode, I wanted this to be a story about love, about wishes, about wishing for love and finding it, about receiving it as ourselves, even with all our sad stories and imperfections. So I feel it's only right that I end with Gillian's wish, which so entranced me, and the Djinn's response, which floored me. Quote, "I wish," said Dr. Berholt to the Djinn, "I wish you would love me." "You honor me," said the Djinn, "and maybe you have wasted your wish, for it may well be that love would have happened anyway, since we are together, sharing our life stories as lovers do." "Love," said Gillian Perrault, "requires generosity. I found that I was jealous of Zafir. You have to read the book to find out who that was. And I've never been jealous of anyone. It was more that I wanted to give you something, to give you my wish," she said incoherently. The great eyes, stones of many greens, considered her. Again, imagine Idris Elba, and the carved mouth lifted in a smile. "You give and you bind," said the Djinn, "like all lovers. You give yourself, which is brave, and which I think you have never done before. And I find you eminently lovable. Come." End quote. I find you eminently lovable in the body, which is not perfect. I find love in you as we share our stories, our rights, our wrongs, our histories, and difficulties. I love how easy it all is, how intentional. In the movie and the book, there are no games, there is no coquette hiding their intentions behind half-truths and mood changes. There is only honesty and bravery, and I love it. I loved it then, and I still love it. But having taken an unexpected turn in our little story about love, where do we go from here? I think we stay hopeful. I really love this story. I, of course, love the idea of sharing stories with someone, of being seen, being heard, even if one is not entirely understood. I like the idea of magical things, of finding something good and holding on to it lightly. Gillian's final wish is to give the Djinn a wish. And of course, he wishes himself home, free, among his people. And I think we have a lot to learn from that. We already knew that Gillian was essentially happy in herself and with herself. She also knew what it was to be imprisoned to someone. In fact, when her husband sends a fax to letting her know he has run off with a young lady and won't be home, she feels a sense of freedom. Quote, she felt, she poetically put it to herself, like a prisoner, bursting chains and coming blinking out of a dungeon. She felt like a bird confined to a box, like Gus confined in a bottle that found an opening and rushed out. She felt herself expand in the space of her own life. End quote. In much the same way, she grants the Djinn his freedom, accepting his love, open to more of it, but also very much aware that she cannot hold on to him because, as he says, he is fire and she is dust. Even if she held on to him in life, she would lose him in death. So she sets him free to come and go as he pleases, which is also nicely done in the movie, by the way. For those of us with difficult stories, I suppose much of the task of our lives will be to find a way to set ourselves free from the bottles in which we find ourselves trapped, the walls that close in, the histories that bind, so that we can be happy in unassuming but satisfying ways. I have made some decisions which have led me in the right direction and have allowed me places of rest and comfort in which I can take shelter and learn and grow and become more than my sad stories. Roxane Gay, in her memoir, indicates that she's on a similar path. So I wish this for those among the listeners of this podcast who need those places of solace and succor. But really, I have one wish for you, and it is love. The wish that brought us here, that led me to read this book, to watch the movie more than once, to hope for magic even if I do not believe in it. I wish that you would experience that love that fills your heart and makes the world seem more magical. We need more than tax returns and daily commutes, Zoom calls and diaper changes to keep us going. I hope you get a little magic dust in the wind and find time to read about the Djinn in the Nightingale's eye. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Join me next week when we'll be talking about more difficult subjects, talking about Shimboska and the aftermath of war. Thank you. Ciao.